Okay, good afternoon. My name is Ahmed. I have four things I have to say. Number one, the phone should look like this. If you don't turn it off now, you won't remember. Second, this mic that I'm holding will move around once we're done with the talk, and the conversation, of course, is the more important part. And it is set on on. Don't turn that, don't change that for technical reasons. And please, when you hold the mic, start with your name, tell us who you are. Otherwise, none of this is going to be picked up. The third item is, usually the first one, introducing Professor Muhammad Fadel. Professor Muhammad Fadel, just to keep things on the surprising side, teaches international transactions and trust laws at Toronto Law School. And today he wants to talk about sacrifice. So we're looking forward to this. I'm actually hopeful that the conversation part, which will start about 30 or 40 minutes from now, will be the better part. I'm sure the presentation will be excellent, but I still want more after the presentation because definitely the conversation is what brings a lot of surprises. I think that's it. Professor Fadel has a PhD from the University of Chicago. It's not just the law degree. He has a law degree from the University of Virginia and has a PhD in Chicago, and his advisor is a recognizable name for people who do Islamic studies, Professor Fadel al-Qadi. Is that true? Right? And he's also a friend, and I always like to just have him around to bounce ideas by him, and I think you will enjoy this conversation. Thank you all for coming. After this, I'm going to sit down. He'll take the questions. He'll decide who asks a question, and the mic will move. So it's now Professor Fadel's territory.
Thank you, Ahmed. Where's my phone, actually? Where's my phone? Oh, I've got it. Did I have to get my phone. I gave. Yeah, because I need to time myself. Wait a second. My phone. I actually, yeah. Does somebody see? That's so weird. I need to. Oh, here it is. Sorry. I was too prepared for my own good. I just wanted to make sure I could time myself, so let me get that going here. Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for inviting me here. I want to give a caveat before I start talking. This paper is definitely out of my comfort zone. I am not a historian of religion, but I'm going to pretend to be one for the next hour and a half or so. And the reason, just to give you a little background on this project, is I don't want to actually be a historian of religion, but I am becoming more and more interested in political theology as a branch of political theory. And those who write in political theology, among the things they kind of emphasize is the importance of religious ideas of sacrifice to contemporary political notions. And so I'm not going to talk about that so much. First, what I want to do is sort of figure out the theological lay of the land, so to speak. But eventually, this is part of a project to develop a kind of Islamic political theology, right? So this is the background of it. That's how it connects to my larger work, right? So please, I look forward to your comments because, as I said, this is not really my area of expertise, and I'd like to learn a lot from people who actually do history of religion and stuff. Okay, so let me start off by just pointing out that I don't think a lot has been written on this topic. There are very few, or I could find very few, doctrinal studies on the Islamic law of ritual sacrifice. The author of the Entry of Sacrifice in the Encyclopedia of Religion points out the radically different conception of sacrifice found in Islam as compared to religions that preceded it. And goes so far as to conclude that as a result of these reforms, Islam doesn't really have a proper notion of sacrifice. I will say that probably goes a little too far, but I think it's an important framing point. Yvonne Sherwood has a very interesting article in the Journal of the American Academy of Religion called Binding, Unbinding, Divided Responses of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam to the Sacrifice of Abraham's Beloved Son. I think that article does a good job of distinguishing Muslim reactions to the story of Abraham's near sacrifice of his son from the Jewish and Christian responses, but I think her analysis fails to tie the Quranic version of the story to its broader critique of pagan and Judeo-Christian conceptions of animal sacrifice. Carol Delaney has a work called Abraham on Trial, but in that work I think she reduces Muslim interpretations of Abraham's near sacrifice to a mere footnote to Jewish and Christian narratives. And to the extent she does discuss Muslim conceptions of the near sacrifice, she relies almost entirely on what I consider the very problematic anthropological work of Combs Schilling, Sacred Performances, Islam, Sexuality, and Sacrifice. John Bowen, also a legal anthropologist of Islam, has a very valuable critique of Combs Schilling's interpretation of Eid al-Adha. He says that essentially she engages in essentializing analysis and obscures the diverse range of practices of sacrifice throughout the Muslim world. Now, this might be a good point for me to, position for me to point out that I'm going to be talking about doctrine. I'm not going to be talking about what Muslims do, what Christians do, what Jews do, what pagans do, right? I'm going to be talking purely from a normative Quranic perspective on things. So I'm not making any claims about any group of people, right? Just to make that clear. Finally, Jonathan Benthal, who's also an anthropologist, has an interesting article called First Fruits in the Quran, but identifies it in a Quranic parable without tying it to any specific legal injunctions. And I think then he goes on and makes the problematic claim that, quote, Hebraic teaching deeply, if often obscurely, underlies the Quran, I think, which is a very common problem in the secondary literature that exists. It ends up assuming that Islamic practices are just some kind of reflection of biblical teachings one way or the other, right? And so I'm going to try to challenge that. Also, there's a careless assimilation of all forms of animal sacrifice in Islam. So everybody seems to think that what the pilgrims are doing on pilgrimage is the same as what people are doing on Eid al-Adha, the major festival, and maybe is the same. I've come across nobody who talks about the sacrifice that's offered on the occasion of a child's birth, right? Anyway, so I will, and then finally, there's also an insufficient attention to Arabian pagan practices, right? And I think the Quran is responding to all these things. So I will begin with an overview of Judeo-Christian theories of sacrifice and then shift my attention to the practices of the pagan Arabians, again, as presented in the Quran. And from there, I will discuss relevant Quranic passages, beginning with its criticism of Judeo-Christian beliefs, and then the practice and beliefs of the pre-Islamic Arabs. Okay. So the Old Testament imposes an obligation on the Israelites to give the first of their crops, herds, and their sons to God, right? One of the passages says, "You shall not put off the skimming of the first yield of your vats. You shall give me the firstborn among your sons. You shall do the same with your cattle and your flocks. 7 days it shall remain with its mother. On the 8th day you shall give it to me." Okay. Now, what are we supposed to make of this passage? There are other passages in the Old Testament as well. Other passages in the Pentateuch, for example, suggest that first sons don't really need to be given to God. They can be redeemed. So every first issue of the womb is mine. From all your livestock, that a male is a firstling, whether cattle or sheep. But the firstling of an ass you shall redeem with a sheep. If you do not redeem it, you must break its neck. And you must redeem every firstborn among your sons. That's Exodus 34:19-20. Exodus 13:1 also reinforces the command to consecrate all firstborn males of man and beast, but says that human sons are to be redeemed. Now, so it's possible to read Exodus 22:28, which is up here, right, in light of the command to redeem sons found in Exodus 13:13 and 34:20. But apparently, at least according to John Levinson, whose analysis I'm relying on here in his book, The Death and Resurrection of the Beloved Son, says many Israelites did not, in fact, read these provisions in this fashion, right? And so many Israelites for a long time, according to Levinson, did in fact actually believe that sacrifice of the firstborn was a good thing, and some of them actually did it, according to Levinson. Now, the Old Testament condemns Israelites for offering their sons as burnt offerings, a ritual it associates with the cult surrounding the pagan god Baal. Right? So this comes in Jeremiah, right, where he condemns them for imitating these pagan practices. Ezekiel also has another passage that is relevant in which he says, I in turn give them laws that were not good and rules by which they could not live. When they set aside every first issue of the womb, I defiled them by their very gifts, that I might render them desolate, that they might know that I am the Lord. Right? So these are texts from the 7th and early centuries of before the Common Era. So Levinson suggests that it is possible that the recipients of Jeremiah's message, however, did not see themselves as apostates or syncretists, but as faithful followers of Yahweh. Right? So if the practitioners of child sacrifice, again quoting Levinson, thought that Yahweh did indeed ordain the rite, then we have here some indirect evidence that the literal reading of Exodus 22:28, you shall give me the firstborn among your sons, was not absurd in ancient Israel. Now, interestingly, we'll look at this last phrase in the Ezekiel passage, in the Jeremiah passage, and which never came into my mind. Levinson reads this as implying that it's criticizing certain Israelites for believing that God's law included recognition of sacrificed sons as something desirable, even if it was not to be carried out by virtue of the substitution of an animal. Jeremiah wishes to declare even that belief itself to be idolatrous. Right? Levinson interprets the Ezekiel passage as admitting that at some point in time Yahweh had indeed ordered Israel to sacrifice firstborns, but did so as a punishment for their disobedience, intentionally degrading them so that they would ultimately recognize Yahweh as their sole God. Levinson suggests that when facing these passages, it's not an either-or position. You don't have to believe that ancient Israelites believed that the firstborn son must be sacrificed, or that he must be redeemed so that those who did it were practicing some sort of popular religion, right? The third choice, which he thinks is probably correct, is that Exodus 22, verse 28, articulates a theological ideal about the special place of the firstborn son, an ideal whose realization could range from literal to non-literal implementation, that is, from sacrifice to redemption, or even to mere intellectual assent without any cultic act whatsoever. Levinson therefore interprets the passage in Jeremiah and Ezekiel as a relatively later development in Israelite religion, in which they try to condemn sacrifice of the firstborn as entirely outside their religion. Therefore, he concludes that the biblical data suggests the best reading of the Old Testament is that at one point in time Yahweh commanded the sacrifice of the firstborn, but now opposes it. Now, why does it remain such an attractive idea? Well, because the idea is that the firstborn son is the most precious thing available for somebody to sacrifice to God. And we see this in this passage from Micah. With what shall I approach the Lord? Do homage to God on high? Shall I approach him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Would the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with myriads of streams of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for my sins? Right? But then it has this passage where it says, none of that will do you any good if you don't have the proper inward disposition, right? He has told you, O man, what is good and what the Lord requires of you, only to do justice and to love goodness and to walk modestly with your God, right? So to the extent, well, obviously people want to resist the apparent sense of the Old Testament in which you're supposed to give your first son to God as an ultimate act of piety. And so they point to this last stanza as saying, well, see, in fact, you're really not supposed to do it. What really counts is your interior disposition. But as Levinson points out, what it does is says that none of this will do you good if you don't have the inward disposition. But it doesn't say you shouldn't do the things that come in advance of it, right? So it's the case, according to him, that the Bible establishes the notion that, quote, the firstborn son is the most precious offering. Right? And then this, of course, becomes manifest most clearly in the story of Abraham and his son, which in the Old Testament is Isaac. And so just to review, in case people aren't familiar with what Genesis says, and he said, take your son, your favorite son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the heights that I will point out to you. Right? Now, the standard reading of this and of this whole story is as though it means abolish human sacrifice, substitute animals instead. Now, the basis of this reading, this common reading, is this verse, 12. And he said, i.e. God, do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Now, Levinson finds this interpretation to be very unpersuasive. God, in fact, in Genesis, never commands Abraham to sacrifice the animal. Israelite tradition explained the substitution of the sheep for the firstborn not by reference to the Akedah, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it properly, but to the Paschal lamb connected with the 10th plague visited upon Egypt. Moreover, the text of Genesis praises Abraham expressly for, quote, his willingness to sacrifice his son. Indeed, he is expressly rewarded for his sacrifice for his willingness to sacrifice his son by the promise of siring a great nation, right? That's the conclusion. By myself I swear, the Lord declares, because you have done this, right? You have done this, and have not withheld your son, your favored one, I will bestow my blessing upon you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars of heaven and the sands on the seashore. Right? So, according to Levinson, the connection between the plain sense of Genesis and the orthodox interpretation of it as abolishing human sacrifice is really quite tenuous. Right? And then we have other stories in the Old Testament as well, including that of an Israelite commander named Jephthah, in which he made a vow prior to battle that if he returned safe and victorious, he would sacrifice to God the very first thing that came out of his house as a burnt offering. And lo and behold, it turned out to be his daughter, which he then did with her agreement. Okay. Now, interestingly, in later rabbinical commentary on these passages, Isaac evolves from a hapless sacrificial victim to a willing martyr. And this takes place during the Seleucid period, right, in which traditions of martyrdom are developed, right, in Jewish thought. And it's crucial that the martyr is redeemed not only in this life, but in the next, right? And it has to redeem Israel as a whole, as a people, right? And so here you have this interesting passage from Maccabee, right, in which the martyrs that are killed by the Seleucids, right, they serve to cleanse Israel of its present sins. So the blood, this is an important theme that I'll try to get to later, is that the blood of the sacrificial victim cleanses the living of their guilt, right? So this becomes an important theme. And Isaac, right, becomes recharacterized not as a lamb, right, who's being taken to sacrifice unknowingly, right, but rather as a hero who willingly embraced redemptive martyrdom on behalf of the Jewish people. Right? And that's kind of the connection between Isaac and the lamb that's slaughtered during Passover. Right? Now, this theme is developed in later Jewish tradition, right, in several different ways. First, Solomon builds the temple on Mount Moriah, right, the site of the supposed sacrifice, near sacrifice of Isaac, right? Although, as I'll tell, but even later developments in rabbinic tradition, some of them suggest that in fact Isaac was killed. So it wasn't just a near sacrifice; it becomes an actual sacrifice, followed by resurrection, by the miraculous resurrection of Isaac. Right? So the theme of father sacrificing beloved son, who willingly accepts his role, then becomes central to both Jewish and Christian conceptions of sacrifice. The free performance of the sacrifice by both father and son both confirms and constitutes the status of the son and his descendants, spiritual and biological, as the beloved of the father. Right? Now, the crucial move that Christianity makes, right, is that it substitutes the church for the Jews. Okay, so just as the Old Testament expels Ishmael from sort of the cycle of blessing, right? Paul basically Ishmaelizes the Jews. And the church takes the position of Isaac in this story of redemption. Right? Now, again, part that I consider very, very important for my larger project is, according to Levinson, the divine favor or chosenness arising out of the symbolism of the sacrifice also provided the symbolic basis for sacral kingship, in which the king is understood to be the Son of God. So Levinson writes, the rule of the Davidic king enthroned upon Mount Zion is a manifestation of the universal dominion of the God of Israel. The former issues from the latter like a son from the Father who begot him. And for those who refuse to, quote-unquote, listen to him, as the story of the Transfiguration puts it in reference to the beloved Son, this has catastrophic consequences. Right? And so, because of this symbolism of exclusive chosenness and exile, right, Levinson says that this idea of Paul creating a universal religion in lieu of Jewish particularism is totally mistaken. Because in fact, what Paul is doing is saying that the church is the true Israel, right? And the only way to be a Jew is to believe in the sacrifice and resurrection of Christ, right? So actual Torah-abiding Jews can't be Jews. They're actually Ishmaelites, right? And only the church is the true Isaac, right? So the only way somebody can become saved is by becoming a Jew, right? So there's no real theory of salvation for Gentiles as Gentiles. You still have to become a Jew, but he radically transforms the conception of Jew from Torah abiding to participating in the sacrifice of the Christ, right? Through this idea of sacral, of chosenness through the Father-Son relationship. Okay. Now, this is not intended to say that Judaism and Christianity are forever wed to this kind of particularism, right? But Levinson's argument is that even though Judaism and Christianity have tried to overcome this over time, the two traditions lose definition and fade when that universalistic affirmation overwhelms the ancient, protean, and strangely resilient story of the death and resurrection of the beloved Son. Now, I think it'll be very important to remember this when we look at some of the Quranic polemic against Christians and Jews. Okay, but now I want to switch to the pre-Islamic Arabians, right? So there are several passages in the Quran that refer to pre-Islamic practices, right, that affirm that they engaged in blood sacrifice, for example. Forbidden for you is blood and what has been consecrated to other than God and what has been slaughtered on the pagan altars. Al-An'am, and of those crops and domesticated animals that God has created, they set aside a share for God, saying, based entirely on their own account, this is for God and this is for our idols. Whatever was set aside for their idols is not permitted to be commingled with that of God's, but whatever was set aside for God is permitted to be commingled with that of the idols. How baneful is their judgment, right? They say these herds of livestock and cereals are forbidden. None may eat of them, so save those whom we will, based solely on their claims. And, quote, it is forbidden to ride or load these animals and livestock over which they do not mention God's name when they slaughter them, blaspheming against God. He shall certainly punish them for their blasphemy. And they say whatever is in the wombs of these herds of livestock are reserved exclusively for our men and forbidden to our women, but they may share in whatever is stillborn. He will punish them for what they say, and God is wise and knowledgeable. Right? And then in another place, God denies responsibility for any of these practices and say that all of these restrictions are blasphemy against him. Right? Now, with respect to what the tradition says about some of these practices, some of the early commentators said that after they would sacrifice an animal on the altars, right, they would take the blood and smear it on sacred places and also put droppings of it on themselves, right? They also suggest they would lay out the meat on the altars and not use it themselves, right? Depends when I consume it, right? That's part of what it meant to sacrifice it to the god. They would kill it and leave it for the god to consume, presumably. Now, 6.136 is not exactly the same as the idea of first fruits, but it's similar insofar as you are reserving a certain portion of foods, both livestock and cultivated foods, and saying, we will not use this, we will dedicate this for the use of a deity, right? And then the same sort of idea is also involved with Bahira, Sa'iba, Wasila, and the Ham. These are certain kinds of camels or livestock. Tabari is basically confused about precisely what they mean because all traces of their usage had disappeared by his time. But basically, again, the idea is that these were some sort of sacred or consecrated animals that in one way or another we were not allowed to use in an ordinary way because they'd been dedicated one way or another to God or a god, right? Just on a side note, if any of you who have studied Islamic law, this actually enters into debates about endowments. So the early Iraqi jurists refused to recognize the legitimacy of endowments because they said endowments are just like these pagan practices because they are restricting the free use of property. And that, like Shurayh has reported, said the Prophet Muhammad came to allow us to have the free use of property, not to restrict our use of property. But anyway, okay. Did the pagan Arabians know child sacrifice? Again, I think this may be a little controversial. I've never seen anything in the secondary literature suggesting that they did, but there is a hint in the Quran that at least some pagan Arabians did. So in 6:136, it says the following, "And so too did their idols make the killing of their children seem beautiful to many of the pagans, until they destroyed them and confused them in their religion." And there's also a report, most commentators on 6:137 associate this with female infanticide. I don't find this to be particularly persuasive reading. There are two other verses in the Quran that mention female infanticide and refer to it expressly. So for example, Takwir, verses 8 through 9, and when the female babe married alive, it uses the term maw'uda, will be asked, "For what sin were you killed?" And then in Surah An-Nahl, verses 58 through 59, when one of them is given news of a daughter, his face blackens in gloom as he struggles to suppress his anger. He hides in shame from his comrades in arms on account of the evil news that was brought to him, trying to decide whether he should keep her despite the humiliation or bury her beneath the dirt. So when the Quran refers to female infanticide, it uses very specific language. Here, the language that's used is qatla awladihim. Awlad, of course, is a generic plural that applies to both male and female children, right? And so I am persuaded that this is actually a reference to sacrifice of children for a religious reason, right? Now, some commentators did affirm, in fact, that pre-Islamic Arabs did this, particularly in the context of votive offerings, where a man would make an oath, like this was the paradigm, where that if God gave him a certain number of sons, that he would offer one of them as a sacrifice to God. There's a very famous story of the Prophet Muhammad himself, in which he was potentially a victim of this indirectly, insofar as his grandfather, Abdul Muttalib, supposedly made such an oath, and when the time came to fulfill it, the lots continually fell on Abdullah, who was destined to be the Prophet's father, right? So the commentary tradition sometimes has the Prophet referring to himself as the son of the two near sacrificial victims, Ismail and Abdullah, right? Okay. So, the second interesting thing, is that in the Muwatta, there's actually a report which says the following, that a woman came to Abdullah ibn Abbas and told him that she had made a vow to God to slaughter her son. Inni nadartu an anhara ibni. Right? So there is some kind of, again, circumstantial evidence that the idea was not completely, the idea was in the environment, is what I'm trying to say. There's also a report in Futuh al-Sham in which Amr ibn al-As supposedly writes a letter to Umar ibn al-Khattab in which he says, the Egyptians have this practice, if there's a drought and the Nile hasn't flooded, that they sacrifice a girl to the Nile, right? I'm sure that's not true, right? But it's in Waqadi's Futuh al-Sham. Okay. So what does the Quran have to say about all this stuff? The pagans do indeed blasphemously lie against God, but most of them do not think, right? يَفْتَرُونَ عَلَى اللَّهِ الْكَذِبَ وَأَكْثَرُهُمْ لَا يَعْقِلُونَ. Right? And if one were to say to them, "Come now, consider what God has revealed and join the messenger of God," they say, "What we have of our fathers' ways suffices us." But what if their fathers were ignorant and were not well guided, right? In the context of Al-An'am, after it mentions these practices, it says, "Sa'a ma yahkumun." How baneful is their judgment, right? And their idols made the killing of their children seem beautiful and confused them in their religion. زَيَّنَ قَتْلَ أَوْلَادِهِمْ شُرَكَاؤُهُمْ لِيَلْبِسُوا عَلَيْهِمْ دِينَهُم. Right? And then it concludes the section by saying the following: "Those who have killed their children foolishly and ignorantly and forbade the bounty that God has provided them, blaspheming against God, have certainly doomed themselves. They have lost the way and certainly are not well guided." Right? Okay. Now, what's interesting in this Quranic critique is not only the blasphemy, but the failure to think about what they're doing, right? So that the pagans followed these practices that violated common sense based solely on the fact that their fathers did it, right? And so their refusal to exercise their natural common self itself warranted divine censure, right? أَكْثَرُهُمْ لَا يَعْقِلُونَ, right? The Quran repeats the same critique of pagan practices of consecrating certain animals and their practice of prohibiting some or all uses of them in Al-An'am as well, right? So the Quran in 6:136, by saying "Sa'a ma yahkumun," points out the incoherence of their judgments. They assign portions of their crops and their livestock to God, but they acknowledge God as the proprietor, right? And so what does it mean to assign a share of something that's already God's to God, right? Secondly, they don't even have enough conviction to follow their own rules, right? So again, according to the commentators, you sort of have this idea that there's a temple here in which certain food has been given to the pagan idols, and a certain temple here for God, and then a wind might come and blow some stuff, some grains from here to here, and if it goes from the idols to God's enclave, they take it and they move it back, right? But if it goes from gods to the pagans, they leave it there for the benefit of the idols, saying, well, God is self-sufficient, God doesn't need it, right? But the idols are weak, and so they do. Right? The Quran's use of zayyana is also very interesting, at least in my view, because it suggests that the failure of their good sense is prompted by beautiful but false rhetoric. What could that rhetoric be other than the claim that the only tangible proof of devotion or fidelity to God is a willingness to sacrifice something dear, with nothing more dear than one's children, right? This is a false conception of religion according to the Quran, but nevertheless one that has some kind of aesthetic resonance, as confirmed by the persistence of this theme throughout the Near East. The result of relying on rhetoric instead of good sense is moral confusion in religion. That's why the Quran uses the verb labisa, which itself connotes the kind of confusion that results from conscious acts of self-deception, in contrast to genuine confusion that is the product of an absence of knowledge. Here the implication is that pagans know that killing their children is sinful, but that knowledge is overcome through a combination of beautiful rhetoric and willful self-deception. So Al-Maturidi, the 10th century Central Asian Muslim theologian, comments that these verses explain why these pagan practices entail a kind of willing self-deception. He notes that human beings have a natural sense of tenderness, shafaqah, and mercy, rahmah, toward their children, particularly weak and defenseless infants, and this would ordinarily prevent them from killing them. Likewise, humans have a natural desire, shahwa, for food that in normal circumstances would act to keep them from arbitrarily prohibiting themselves from wholesome sources of nutrition. In the case of the pagan Arabs, however, it was the beautiful but false religious rhetoric that led them, in both cases, to act in ways contrary to their nature, thereby leading them to perdition. Okay. So, now, but the Quran also provides what I call a positive theology, a replacement for this sort of beautiful but false theology, right? One that suggests that God creates everything for us and for us to use, right? And so, far from banning us, so far from piety consisting in banning ourselves from enjoying them, what we should do is share a little bit and keep the rest prudently, right? So here it says, after mentioning all the things that God has created, it then says, eat from them all when they ripen, but give over what is due in respect of them when they are harvested, but do not be extravagant, for God does not love the extravagant. Now, according to Tabari, extravagance here applies both in the sense of extreme miserliness, where a cultivator is too niggardly to share, and also who has a kind of reckless sense of his own well-being and wants to give away everything, right? So what's required is a prudent sense of responsibility toward others, neither going to the extreme of depriving oneself of God's bounties, nor of being so miserly as to refuse to share with those less fortunate. And the same logic applies to domesticated animals. Because God created them for our benefit, it is appropriate for us to use for all our needs, whether to ride, load baggage and goods, and to use their hair for carpets and other products, etc. Right? So that's what's affirmed in these other verses. And some livestock for riding and others for furnishing. Eat therefore from what God has provided you, and do not follow Satan's footsteps, for he is a plain enemy to you. Right? And then the general rule about food: say, Muhammad, I find nothing in what has been revealed to me that prohibits a man from eating what he wishes, save carrion, blood, pig flesh, for it is foul, or that which has been consecrated to other than God, except for someone who is compelled to do so, neither desiring it nor going to excess. Right? So arbitrarily prohibiting people from the benefits or the bounties of God is itself blasphemous in the Quranic conception. Right? So too is excessive generosity. So too is excessive miserliness. Right? Now, even though there should be some sort of restriction, some things are unwholesome, either in themselves, like carrion, right, or for whatever reason, God thinks that pigs are not worth eating. Those restrictions are lifted if one is facing, right, dire circumstances. Again, because the idea here is that to force people not to eat food in circumstances where they would die would basically undermine the purposes of creation. So there must be an allowance here. Interestingly, our friend Ash-Shaybani, in the 2nd century Hanafi jurist, says that while it is permissible for a Muslim to die at the hands of a pagan who insists that he renounce Islam, in fact, it's honorable to do so, it is sinful for a Muslim to die out of starvation if carrion or pig is available. Right? Okay. Now, what about animal sacrifice and how this is reformed in the Quran? I think most of the work happens in Surah Al-Hajj, Surah 22, right? So the Quran says, again, affirming this positive theology of the purposefulness of creation, that they may reap some benefits for themselves, and that they may remember God's name on some days designated therefor, in gratitude for the herds of livestock that he has given to them as provision. Eat therefore from them and feed the miserable poor. Right? The them here is talking about the camels that the pilgrims consecrate for sacrifice on pilgrimage. Okay, so I've got 5 minutes supposedly. Got still a lot to do. Now, so the animal breeders, the pilgrims, are supposed to continue using the animals after they've been consecrated. Right? So if you sort of imagine the way this works, is that when you set out on pilgrimage, you identify a camel, this is going to be sacrificed, and that's actually what shi'ar means. So the Quran uses the word sha'air because it's marked. So when you begin and you set off on pilgrimage, you take a knife and you mark the camel with a blow to its side, right? And you garland it. That's taqlid. You put like a necklace around it. That way everybody knows that it's designated for sacrifice. So the pagan idea is once you do this, we saw this earlier with the bahira, wasila, etc., once it's consecrated, it now comes out of the realm of sort of the human economy. It's part of the divine economy now. It's not for you to use. Again, the Quran rejects that and says you may continue to use them until an appointed time, and their destination is to the ancient house. Right? Okay. And so finally, once they're sacrificed, of course, you should eat them, which again seems very natural to us, but not to the pagans at the time, right? Because that sort of undermined the whole idea of the sacrifice to God that humans would do it. In fact, Tabari reports, or some of the commentators report, that the pagans criticized the Muslims for saying, you refuse to eat the meat that God killed, i.e. carrion, but then you eat the meat that you killed yourself, right, i.e. the sacrificial animals. Okay. Another example of this, which is again from the Muwatta, in which the Prophet is when he sets out on pilgrimage, and there's a man walking beside his camel and clearly having a hard time, and the Prophet says, why don't you ride him? And the man says, but he's consecrated for sacrifice. And so the Prophet says, ride it, confound you, and says that 3 times to try to get the point that just because it's consecrated to God does not mean that you are now prohibited from using it. So this is an introduction, I think, to the bigger project of the Quran, which is to announce a kind of natural religion. Okay? And this is also set out, I think, in the verses in Hajj. So and what's the content of it? Well, avoiding blasphemy and avoiding the filth of idols. Being upright in the worship of God, hunafa, and not engaging in polytheism. Having internal reverence. And that this is a universal religion. And so the Quran says that every people in the world has a right for the sacrifice of animals for honoring God, not for these other things, right? And then again, on the same theme of internal reverence, right? That those whose hearts tremble when God is mentioned, okay? They're steadfast in the face of tragedy. They pray regularly, and they are generous with whatever they have. Right? And then it concludes by saying about sacrifice, neither their flesh nor their blood shall ever reach God, while your piety does. Accordingly, he gave you dominion over them, so you may magnify God for having guided you, and give glad tidings to those who do well. Right? Okay. So the immateriality of sacrifice is again confirmed in other verses in the Quran that say things like, I have not created jinn or humans save to worship me. I desire neither provision for them, ma uridu minhum min rizqin, wala an yut'imun, nor do I wish for them to feed me. Right? So this is the criticism, and then the positive theology, and then this, I think, lays the ground. Can I keep going? Okay, I'll have to wrap this up very quickly. What does the Quran say about Abraham's near sacrifice? This is the story here. The take-home point for me is that the Quran is absolutely silent on who the child is. The Quran is indifferent as to whether it's Isaac or Ismail. The context suggests that it's Ismail, but it doesn't really care. It then says, right, at the end, we gave him the glad tidings of Isaac, a prophet, one of the upright, after all of this is over, and we did bless him. And among the descendants of both are those who do good and those who plainly wrong against themselves. Right? So the kind of sibling rivalry that dominates the Old Testament story is done away with here. Right? Again, in Baqarah 2:124, when it says, when his Lord tried Abraham with some words and he completed them, he said, I shall make you a leader of the people. Abraham then asked, and what of my descendants? He said, my covenant does not include the unjust. Right? Interestingly, the Quran uses the word kalimat, so it's ambiguous. How did God test Abraham? One might think that it's referring to the near sacrifice, but the commentators don't even bring up the sacrifice at all. They mainly talk about the rites of the pilgrimage. Right? So the sacrifice, far from being the central religious event, is discounted entirely in the Quran as the central event constituting piety. Right? And then I think this is the background why we can understand these kinds of criticisms of the Jews and Christians that we see in the Quran, in which they claim particular relationship to God that distinguishes them from the rest of human beings. Now I'll conclude. So I think there are lots of traces to this doctrine on collateral doctrines in Islamic law, which is very important to me. Demotion of sacrifice and substitution of prayer as the central religious rite. Rejection of the sacral nature of blood Replacement of first fruit and firstlings offerings by zakat and sadaqah, right? There's a lot of stuff I wanted to say, but no time. And also, very interestingly, the Islamic law of inheritance. So out of the Old Testament comes a rule of primogeniture, right? Whereby the first son was favored in all sorts of things. Not simply that he had to be sacrificed, which was be redeemed, but then he got an excess share of the estate and blessings, etc., etc. But in Islam, as we know, all sons are treated equally, all daughters are treated equally, and all of them must be included. The doctrine of martyrdom is very interesting, that I think can be tied into this. First of all, there's no idea of the martyr redeeming the nation. Secondly, dying, like on the battlefield or under persecution, is only one category of martyrdom, right? One can be a martyr by dying of dysentery, drowning, burning, and a woman giving birth, right? That's also a way of achieving martyrdom, right? And the law of the caliphate. So if the idea of the father-son relationship and the sacred father-son relationship is the paradigm for sacral kingship, if you reject the idea of this relationship, then you can't have sacral kingship. And of course, the caliphate denies the idea of sacral kingship, right? It's just a person that is selected among the community. So you can see where I want to go with this, right? I'm much more interested in developing how these theological concepts apply broader politically. I'm very interested to hear your views, and just concluding, and these are the concluding points. No, I'll leave them there for you to consider. Thank you.
Okay, forget about animal sacrifice. I want to go back to the human side. It seems that there are two sides to sacrifice. There's something that you can't live without. You're going to have to sacrifice, whether you like it or not. And that side, I mean, when I think about modern applications of this, of course, I mean, an immigrant like me, somebody who left his homeland 21 years ago, sacrificed his family. There is no real normal relationship with either parents or siblings after an immigration like this. If we talk about the son and the daughter, you know, I sacrifice my time with them for reasons that might not stand to everybody's mind. But there's something, of course, Islam wants to stop. That idea that you can sacrifice for something like maybe macho sacrifice. In modern times also, an American Muslim family wanting to prove its patriotism, so they send their kids to the army so that they can die, and then, you know, that you achieve that status of being an American, very, very American family. So I want to push you to the modern world. I mean, I'm with you, of course, and I'm also happy you mentioned the Shaybani reference, even though the specific example is a problem, that dying in battle is okay for him, right? And there must be a way to think about this in modern terms that are different, because it may have been a good idea in the 8th century, but I think now we need to think about that differently. But the categories stand, right? There is a lot of sacrifice that's just bad. You can't justify it in Islam's 15th century and the 21st century. Anyway, I'll leave it up to you.
Yeah, well, I think what the Quran is trying to do is place a rational limitation on what we should give up for God, right? That God doesn't demand our self-destruction, right? So there's a sacrifice is altruistic, other regarding, right? Not expiatory, right? So that's a very important idea. There's no idea of a scapegoat. So we're not slaughtering the lamb on Eid because we are putting our sins on the lamb, killing it, and thereby cleansing ourselves. So that sense is completely purged, right? But more importantly, there's also a limit on what we are required to do for others, right? So when you were talking about your child, I just thought of a verse in the Quran. I wish I had memorized it, but there's the verse in the Quran that said that neither the father nor the mother should be harmed on account of her child, right? So the obligations for the obligations for rearing future generations have to be shared equitably, right? So neither the father nor the mother suffer an unreasonable harm, right? And this is, I think, what the Quran is resisting, is this ancient idea that piety consists in these superheroic acts of destruction, right? That's not what true piety is. That's actually blasphemous, right? And this is where I'm trying to go with the idea of in political theology and democracy in particular, because Paul Kahn, in his work, Political Theology, emphasizes the example that you specifically give of parents willingly sending their children to die in war. And he derives that from the Abraham-Isaac story in the Old Testament and the completely arbitrary nature of that command, right? That this is the paradigm idea of political sacrifice in our modern political culture. And what I'm trying to say is the Quran gives a different conception of sacrifice, right? Which I think is actually much more consistent with the kind of democratic ideals that we want to have, right? Again, in the law of jihad, very interesting. Yes, it is absolute duty on every single person to engage in jihad when attacked by the enemy. And even though, of course, we Muslims want everybody to be a Muslim and, jihad al-talab, expansion, blah, 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 blah. But in wars of choice, if the father or mother say, I don't want you to go, you cannot go, right?
Needs a parent's permission.
Yes, you need your father or mother's permission to go on a war of choice, as we would say. They are not obliged to send you, right? So there's a kind of rational limitation to sacrifice. This is, I think what I'm trying to work out. Adam.
No, wait. So, okay, wait. No talking about this. And bring it back to the Sayyid after he's done.
Okay. So I'm wondering what you would do with the Quranic passages about the idea of selling one's self, that is to say one's life or one's goods, to God in order that to be repaid many times over in paradise.
Yeah. I definitely need to work on that further, right? But as I was sort of saying to Ahmed, I think what's crucial here is two things. Is that there's no idea that the martyr redeems the living, right? So his blood is not cleansing in that sort of way, right? Secondly, there is a kind of time, there is a sense in which there is a time for necessary sacrifice, right? So if you are under attack, yes, Islamic law says you have an obligation to participate in defense of your territory. But the issue is, and that seems to be sort of consistent with the rational intuition, if you live in a just society, you have an obligation to defend it. Okay, fine. But you have an obligation to go to, today, if you're an American, to go Afghanistan, right? We would say that in Islamic terms, that's jihad al-talab, right? Does that apply there? Well, the jurist said, no, it doesn't. Because that's not an individual obligation on people, right? These jihads of choice are not, right? And so that's how I think I need to work that out. And also, furthermore, this idea that military jihad, or even jihad or even martyrdom as a means of, as a result of persecution, that's only one form of martyrdom, right? Dying in the plague, dysentery, wall falling on you, et cetera, that's all equally martyrdom. There's actually another report in Muwatta in which the Prophet is standing next to a grave of a man as he's being buried, and somebody says, oh, what a baneful bed for a believer. And then the Prophet says, mind what you're saying. And he said, oh, well, I meant it would have been better for him to die in the battlefield. And the Prophet says, yes, nothing is equivalent to martyrdom, but there is nothing more precious to me than dying and being buried in this spot of earth, right? So, yes, and sometimes we are called upon to be martyrs, but it's not something that we should seek out intentionally, right? And I think Ibn Salam actually talks about this, that a martyr is not rewarded for dying, right? A martyr is rewarded for his courage in defending the community, right? And because if he weren't willing to do that, the community would be destroyed, right?
Yes. So, with regard to your second bullet point, sacrifice is other regarding and not expiatory. To what extent have you considered the hadith literature? And I'm thinking about the idea of self-sacrifice through self-confession for zina, and how that results in death. And in the construction of one account, which is of a woman who self-confesses, the prophet says her death is equal to the repentance of 70 people of Medina. And it's very much constructed in an exculpatory fashion. Yeah.
I mean, that's what I was saying. This is the Quranic theology of sacrifice. Yeah, there are other things to consider for sure, right? So, yeah, fair enough.
I wanted to ask you to elaborate on your idea of natural religion.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any relation to the 20th century literature on fitna?
Fitna?
Fitna, yeah. I mean, is that Faruqi who wrote about that?
Or fitra.
Fitra, sorry, fitra. And going back to the word labisa,
Yeah.
when you're talking about that with pagans and stuff, and translating that as self-deception, is this an unnatural or contra, alternatural kind of practice that pagans are being
Well,
blamed for?
Well, labisa, right, is the same root as clothing,
Mhm.
right? So you cover something up. So it's the kind of reasoning in which you are engaged in denying something that you sort of know is there by ignoring it. Willful blindness is sort of what we would say in law, right? You're being willfully blind to something. That's different than doubt, right? You can be doubtful about something because you don't know. That's shak, right? So the Quran uses the verb from the root labisa, which I think is morally significant, right? Because it's trying to distinguish it from genuine intellectual doubt, right? Now, I don't think the Quran uses the word fitra there. It does, certainly not in that surah. It does use the word fitra from time to time. And of course, in the 20th century and the 21st century, there's been a lot of emphasis on this idea of Islam and natural religion, right? On the other hand, there's this tension. Well, what does it mean to have a revealed religion if you've got natural religion? And so there's obviously a tension between the two. But what I'm suggesting here is, in fact, a different idea, a different way of suggesting that the Quran points to a way of universal religion that's seriously universal, not in the way that Paul transforms Judaism, which is not really universal, right? Because it says that every people have a nusuk. Every people, a mensek. God has given every people a rite that they observe to show gratitude. So that there are certain virtues that the surah of a pilgrimage mentions as sort of being naturally associated with true religion, right? And that these are not particularly, revealed in any sort of way. Anyone of good sense would follow this, the Hanif, right? The Quranic idea of Hanif, right? And so when the Quran speaks about following the religion of Abraham, what it's trying to say is that these sort of natural dispositions, these natural religious dispositions, that's the religion of Abraham, right? And that's what it means when the Quran says Muslims are followers of Abraham, in that sort of sense. People might accuse me now, well, what's the point of revelation, etc. But I think that's the message of that chapter. How to reconcile it with other specific things, that's a different point, right? And the prophethood of Muhammad, etc. That's, I think, another thing. But I definitely think that there is a universalism there that is absent in at least late antique Jewish and Christian theologies. Yes?
Thank you very much for your talk. This is a bit of an open-ended question.
What's your name?
Rashal Amari.
Oh, okay.
So I was wondering, the verses that you mentioned are clearly very crucial for the concept of sacrifice in Islam. And I was wondering if in the commentaries you've looked at thus far, you've seen any elements of tension or difference in their interpretation that you would like to address. that you think was significant?
Look, I haven't. There are literally hundreds.
Sorry,
of,
this is a
hundreds
very open-ended
hundreds
question.
of exegetes, right?
Right.
And so I basically looked at three: Tabari, Zamakhshari, and Fakhruddin al-Razi, right? And I can't see really substantial differences there. The biggest thing is where I saw disputes was about what does qatl al-awlad mean? Is it female infanticide or is it something else, right? Of course, I wasn't looking for these other things. These other things are, like, there are lots of differences of what I consider tertiary doctrines on certain rituals and pilgrimage, right? Which aren't really central to the major theme, right? Yeah, so I can't, there are lots of obviously detailed differences among the jurists with respect to various practices, right? But I don't think they're relevant to the larger question.
Wilson Poon, I'm a physicist from Edinburgh, so I'm going to put my foot in it because I don't know anything about any of this.
Well, I don't know very much either.
I'm here for the free lunch. So I wonder whether your interpretation or citation evidence from the Old Testament in particular, and in your attempt to bring a universal dimension to this, is in danger of putting slightly too much emphasis on the sacrifice of Isaac. I mean, going back to Levinson, other of his work emphasizes the importance of the concept of covenant in the Old Testament. So there's a series of covenantal sacrifices that goes back to, you know, the first murder was committed when Cain and Abel built different altars to offer different sacrifices. That was way before Abraham. After the flood, Noah built altar to sacrifice to God, and those are again universal covenants. So that, you know, the idea of sacrifice goes way back to creational theology. I think there's a dimension there that needs teasing out if you want to make a comparison.
There's things I didn't get to say, but again, I mean, according to Levinson, the sacrifice of Isaac has this covenantal dimension, right? I mean, the two aren't disconnected.
No, they're totally connected.
They're completely connected. But this is the point about the Quranic story, is that it strips the sacrifice of any transgenerational covenantal implications, right? So when God completes his test of Abraham and says, I'm going to make you an imam for people, a leader for people, and Abraham says, well, what about my descendants? He says, my covenant doesn't include the unjust, right? And after it mentions the story of the near sacrifice and then the birth of Isaac, and then God says, and we blessed both of them. And among their descendants are those who do good and those who are plain wrongdoers, right? So it disconnects the covenantal element from the sacrifice element, right? And replaces instead this, what I'm saying is this idea of natural religion, which is universal, right?
No, but my point is precisely that if you go back in the Old Testament,
Yeah,
you go all the way back to Noah, which is pre-Abrahamic.
yeah,
You know, and there, the offering of the sacrifice that is pleasing to God after the flood totally links covenant with sacrifice, and it is universal because that is long, long, long before.
okay, I
all
mean,
these other stuff.
look, I'm not claiming to be an expert on the Old Testament or anything. I'm just going by what Levinson says as this idea of the father, the covenant being represented by the father's willingness to sacrifice the beloved son as being constitutive of Jewish and Christian theology in late antiquity, right? That this is sort of the core idea of the religion, and the only way to understand Paul's theology, right? So Paul, in Hebrews, in trying to explain the role of Christ, tells them that we know that the only way to remit sins is through blood. And so in order to have universal salvation, you have to have the greatest kind of sacrifice, right? The Christ, right? Which is God, right? Because that's the only blood capable of remitting universal sin, right? So, I mean, it's just a very different idea.
You're right. I want to stay on this, and actually, if Bruce wants to come back, Isaac is the father of Israel. This Aqidah is what creates Judaism. I think by going backward to Noah, you are in a realm that is not exactly Judaism.
Well, that's
Very good. So if I am right about this, because I'm of course also repeating what my professors said, Septimus and other people, that I don't think we're creating a real problem by going before Judaism, because it would still be true that as far as Judaism is concerned, look, every child of Israel has a share in the world to come, right? And this is exactly what لا ينال عهدي الظالمين is trying to go against. The unjust are not going to be, there's nothing mysterious about lineage that make you special. While in Judaism, of course, lineage makes you special because this covenant is what makes you a child of Israel. Okay, if I'm wrong, go ahead.
Wait, if I just one other thing. But again, going back to your point, one of the interesting things in the Quran, and it's, again, in its polemic against Judaism and Christianity, is it says Abraham was neither a Jew nor a Christian.
Yeah,
right? And so it does try to go back before, but again, you don't really need to, because it reinterprets the whole sacrificial story in a way that purges it of any kind of sectarian element, right? And if you want to call that restoring it to a time of pre-Judaism, that's fine, because the Quran also says that, right? Adam.
So, so you know what says in the prayer, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala al Muhammad, kama salli ala Ibrahim wa ala al Ibrahim, and so on. So, what would you do with that notion of the al, right? There's a notion of a.
Oh, God.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So God, pray for, perhaps bless Muhammad and the al of the family or clan of Muhammad,
Yeah.
descendants of Muhammad. I don't know.
People of.
Well, could yes, right? As you have.
Bless the people of Abraham.
The
Yeah.
people of Abraham and the people of Abraham. Yes.
Yeah. No, I mean, this is, again, one of these tensions that I'll try to work out in my larger project, because in the political, there's always a need to take a universal and make it particular because of identity, right? So again, you can, if I move to the realm of political, yes, in theory, anyone can be the caliph, but in practice, it needs to be from Quraysh, right? Because Quraysh, there's a kind of identity associated with somebody from Quraysh as being of the Prophet that's not totally rational, right? So there's always this tension that political theology is mediating between the universal and the particular, right? And so yes, there is the universal religion, the natural religion that is emphasized in, like what I was saying, this surah, in which it's trying to push back against the paganism of Arabia. But at the same time, it affirms certain rights that are very particular. I think what's very interesting is that, as I said, why do I say prayer is the central right of Islam? Because that's something that every Muslim has to do 5 times a day, no matter what. If you're sick, you have to pray as best as you can. But look at pilgrimage. The obligation to perform pilgrimage is extremely contingent, right? You have to be able to satisfy a whole bunch of prerequisites before you're obligated to go on pilgrimage. And then it's binary. You don't do a partial pilgrimage if you don't have all the full capacity the way you do prayer, right? So pilgrimage is the most historically specific ritual of Islam. Okay, so that creates an identity, right? Like if you ask people, what's Islam? Mecca, pilgrimage, everybody knows that, right? But it's the least attenuated religious ritual in Muslim life, right? You have to do it once, if at all. Whereas prayer is something that's constant throughout one's religious life, right? And that's the most universal, right? So there's always this tension between the particular and the universal. And what I'm interested in doing is trying how to map this out in ritual law and what it means for political ideas of citizenship and belonging and how we can think of the universal in particular in our life as citizens.
My name is Tomi Pulkkinen. I'm a PhD student, history department. I'd like to just offer a alternative perception of the part of the Muslim prayer where it's asked to God to bless Muhammad and the house of Muhammad as Abraham and the house of Abraham. Just to point out that that is part of a prayer and it's a petition to God. And so if that were the case, automatically because of the lineage, what would be the purpose of petitioning God and essentially making dua to that end? What I'm trying to say is that it's a form of Muslim piety to ask the highest blessing for the Prophet, but it's not in the Quran promised that because of somebody belongs to the Ali Muhammad, they will be blessed.
What it says, what does it say? What
Well, what he's saying is
Salli ala Muhammad wa ala ali Muhammad, right?
why are we asked in our prayers to have a specific invocation to God to bless the family, folk, you know, you could,
What's the answer in your mind?
Well,
When you ask that question, what do you have in mind?
It's a response to this. So it's a response to this question about, and you raised the question of whether or not the blessing sort of is passed down hereditarily, right? I mean, that aspect of the covenant.
yeah.
I think it's suggesting, in fact, because God, what does God promise the children of Abraham in the Hebrew Bible, right?
Lots of descendants and lots of land.
So what we're asking God to offer this the same in a sense to.
Well, that's interesting, right? Because there's a lot of things to do here, and I'm not in history of religion, since you guys are better equipped to do this. But the shortest surah in the Quran, Al-Kawthar, right? You know, the prophet was sonless, and that itself is very interesting in this world, right? And his opponents constantly lampoon him because he has no son. So you have a surah about this. Inna a'tainaka al-kawthar. We haven't given you a son, but we've given you this heavenly reward of this spring in the next life. فَصَلِّ لِرَبِّكَ وَانْحَرْ. Right? So go ahead and pray and make your slaughter for God. Right? So again, the connection between slaughtering and sonship is severed and replaced with the idea of divine reward rather than this life. Right? But there's a lot, I think, once we start thinking about these concepts and looking at the Quran from that perspective, there's a lot that can be done sort of in the world of symbolic religious studies.
Actually, I was thinking about what do you exactly mean by universality and particularity. You already said by universality you mean natural religion. But how it's related to the question of exclusion and inclusion, because although it emphasizes the universality, also it excludes Jews and Christians.
Well, that's an interesting question. I don't know if that's true, right? There are lots of verses in the Quran, I think, that are saying to Christians and Jews, okay, you don't want to accept Muhammad as a prophet, but we should be able to agree on certain sorts of things, right? You know, that we will not seek to dominate one another, right? لا يتخذ بعضنا بعضا أربابا, etc. You know, we should not worship other than God, right? And we should not take each other as masters of one another. You know, وَلِكُلٍّ جَعَلْنَا شِرْعَةً وَمِنْهَاجًا, etc. فَاسْتَبِقُوا الْخَيْرَاتِ, right? So I think there are lots of, at least Quranically, right, lots of sort of passages that are sort of opening doors to sectarian religion. To say, okay, you don't want to accept everything Muhammad says, fine, but do these other things, which are consistent with what I'm saying is the Quranic view of natural religion. But what's not natural religion is to think that you have a filial relationship with God. That is not a part of natural religion. It's a lie, right? I mean, I didn't get to read the verse, but you know, the Quran mocks this claim that accuses Jews and Christians of saying that we are the children of God. Right? He says, no, you're not. You're just other people. God punishes you for your sins like anybody else. Right? So, you know, stay Christians and Jews if you want, but behave in accordance with natural religion. Right?
Maybe just I want to emphasize, like, there is always a tension between universal
Yeah.
and
Well,
particularity.
this is the paradox, I think, of universalism. Right? What's the conditions of it? So I think what's clear in the Quran is that the conditions of universal are meaning a certain kind of rationality. Right? Pagans are excluded because they're irrational. Right? Their conception of piety, right, is not consistent with common sense. Right? That's the whole point of أَكْثَرُهُمْ لَا يَعْقِلُونَ, which is, again, you can find it again and again in the Quran. So natural religion is not syncretic, and it's not undemanding, right? It's demanding, right? But it's not necessarily sectarian.
I like this very much, actually. So there is a tension, of course, between what you just said and some of the things you said earlier. And I think that tension is going to be there. By Islam being universal, it means anybody can be a Muslim. The Quran, however, recognizes
Yeah.
not everybody's going to be a Muslim. That's the only way to clear the tension in my mind.
Yeah.
So again, everybody can be a Muslim. But it's just not, either it's not God's plan or it's not in human beings' nature to all agree on even that minimum, by the way, that the Quran wants. So even the agreement that, because of course the Quran is appealing to Jews and Christians to agree with Muslims on certain things. There is a pretension or a sense in the Quran that the Quran has a better interpretation of the world or a less distorted view of things. So Jews and Christians who are reasonable can still agree on a few things without saying that Muhammad actually hears divine voices. So everybody can be a Muslim, and a lot of people won't be a Muslim, and which means also that all these verses and hadiths that keep coming up about Prophet Muhammad predicting that Islam will be everywhere have to be completely chucked because they just are in utter contradiction with basic things in the Quran. That's the only way I can understand universalism, because if you really want to claim that Islam is for everybody, meaning everybody's potentially a Muslim, it doesn't work, right?
I want to back up and say something again, because I want to contrast this with Paul, right? Yes, in Paul's theology, everybody can attain salvation, but everybody attains salvation by becoming Jewish in the right way, at least according to Levinson, right? So you cannot be saved as a Gentile. This is what I'm saying is what's different, is that these kinds of virtues that the Quran mentions as being part of true religion, those don't require me to become Jewish or Muslim or Christian or anything, right? These particular virtues, the Quran seems to suggest are within the capacity of everybody. That's why I'm saying that that's sort of a Quranic theory of natural religion that is universal, because it doesn't require me to become anything other than a human being, right?
Levinson is Jay, right? Jay, not John. Jay Levinson is the
John
one who
Levinson,
wrote.
J-O-N, yeah.
Is the one who wrote. How do we know this about the rabbinic law? And is the Harvard scholar or somebody else?
I don't know what else he's written, but
Because I mean, of course, what he's saying cannot be accepted by non-Jews. I mean, what he's saying is, yeah, Paul universalizes Judaism. You'd hear that from different people. But what it means to most people, other than Levinson, is he makes the Gentiles capable of being part of the same correct view. I mean, he embellishes it a little bit here. Levinson is saying, well, you have to become a Jew first. Or now, is Judaism now for everybody? This is a new thing.
it's a new kind of Judaism. It's a Judaism of the spirit, right? Yeah, it's Judaism of the spirit, that the Gentile becomes saved by becoming a new kind of Jew. But a Gentile cannot be saved as a Gentile, right? That's Levinson's analysis of Paul's theology, right? That you have to become the new kind of Jew because Christ represents the triumph of spirit over flesh, right? So just as Isaac displaces Ishmael, because Ishmael is born of the flesh, okay, and Isaac is the miraculous spirit because Sarah is barren, okay? So Christ also is a perfection of the spirit, right? And so by continuing to follow the Torah, you're essentially a slave of the flesh, okay? But as a Gentile, you have to become Jewish in the right way. There's nothing in being a Gentile that's redeemable, right? What I'm saying here is that the Quran's message is that no, everybody is redeemable. Because there's nothing, I mean, so that's why there's a different idea here, right? Now, whether or not that entails recognition of the Prophet Muhammad as the prophet, what I'm saying, that doesn't seem to be required here, right? And as I was saying to the young woman over here, there are sort of like attempts to tell sectarian religions like Judaism and Christianity that, you know, okay, don't accept Prophet Muhammad's claims, but there's still you're still bound by natural religion, right? And that's a basis for common membership in a common human community, right? Anyway, I don't know. That's
So maybe one last question for me anyway. So then I wonder what you would do with, say, Donner's argument about Muhammad's community being an ecumenical community of
Yeah.
believers that transcends people who we now would think of as being Muslims. It sounds like you might actually agree with him on that one.
I haven't read it. I need to. I might. I mean, it's not crazy from a theoretical perspective, right? I don't think so, right? I mean, I'm not sure exactly what he says. I mean, but there is the tension, I think. There's certainly, I think it would be very hard to deny that there's a particular Muslim identity from very early. The question is, what does it do? How do you reconcile it with also the clearly universal elements that are not dependent on Muhammad? Because, again, we have a lot of theological debates that are unresolved and unresolvable in later Islam. Like, is ethical knowledge of God's law derived exclusively from revelation, or is it known by, reason? Well, clearly the Quran says both, right? Or else the criticisms of the pagans and the Christians would be nonsensical, right? I mean, if it's not blasphemous to believe in these things until the Prophet came, then why is the Quran criticizing them, right? But it's saying that the pagans should have known better than to do these things, right? And the Jews and Christians should have known better than to claim that they're the sons of God, right? So there's got to be something there. And so, I mean, again, I'm interested in these bigger questions of reconciling the particular and the universal and how Islam can sort of do that, particularly for, things I'm more interested in, which is like law and politics. But I want to go back to theology.
So, I mean, you're relying on Levinson's interpretation of Paul. That, of course, is a very particularist interpretation of Paul. You yourself quoted the letter to Hebrews. The authorship by Paul was disputed almost from the early church. But, the thing that is never disputed, for example, is letter to the Galatians, where he quite clearly said, there is no longer Jew or Greek, male or female. That seemed to thus transcend it and not, say that you have to become a Jew. There are other strands of New Testament theology. John's Gospel and arche and hologos. In the beginning was the Word. This was long before they were Jew or Gentile. John 1:14, kai hologos, sarx ageneto. Then the Word became flesh, not Jewish flesh, all flesh. That interpretation of Paul is not necessary, nor is it sufficient.
Maybe.
Well, there's no maybe about it. What I said is definitely right. I'm not claiming any one interpretation is right,
No,
but that interpretation of Paul is not the only way one
Fair
can
enough.
read Paul or the New Testament.
Fair enough, but it seems that the Quran thinks that's what Christians of the time seem to believe, right? The Quran attributes to the Christians of the 7th century this kind of exclusivist idea, right? That's related to a father-son relationship. That's why it seems to me that Levinson's interpretation is at least something to consider as being representative of at least certain Christian views.
Well, there's no question about that. That is
Right.
true, but I mean, almost
so,
any view can be ascribed to almost any sect.
And so I'm not, but I mean, it couldn't be a trivial view, right? Or else the Quran wouldn't have mentioned it, right? I mean, the Quran is there's intertextuality in it, right? It's engaged in self-conscious polemics against other groups. So presumably it's only going to do that if those arguments are recognizable by the other group, right? And then John says, "For God so loved the world that," I can't remember exactly, that He gave His only begotten Son. So it explicitly invokes this idea of Father, Son, and everything that we have, the baggage that sort of comes with that, right? So it doesn't seem that the Levinson interpretation is absurd in any sort of way.
One. Can I ask you a different question?
Yeah, of course.
A different line of questioning. So your business about natural religion and pagans are irrational. So I've always found it interesting to see how religions deal with Lucretius. So Lucretius, before Christ, wrote De Rerum Natura, on the nature of things. Famously, in Book 1, he critiques human sacrifice. There's a Greek general who sacrificed his daughter for his fair wind. And he says, the point about religion is that it gets you on into this, in modern terms, superstition, and therefore you can live a much happier life without all these superstitions.
Well, I think the Quran agrees with that.
So I was going to ask you whether there are any known Islamic interaction with what they make of Lucretius.
I don't know if
long tradition of this
there's
critique.
in Islamic philosophy has a specific engagement with him or not. But this is what I said, I'm sorry, in sort of my concluding points, I said that one of the take-home points for me is that the tension in Islam is not between religion and I mean reason and revelation, but between natural religion and popular religion.
So which one is Lucretius?
Natural religion. Natural religion would not allow us to sacrifice our children, but popular religion will. So all the practices that the Quran associates with paganism, right, is popular religion. It results from a bad use of reason. So the Quran uses zayyana. It makes it beautiful. They made it beautiful, right? So they took something that was ugly and convinced themselves it was beautiful, right? Like killing their children. So what I would say is that that's popular religion and bad. Natural religion, which is sort of consistent with aql, reason, is good. So Lucretius, I don't know what his theology was, but
well, he was an atheist,
yeah,
so there's no theology.
But he could be, you could have a natural religion which would agree exactly with what he said, that this popular religion is superstition and bad, because that's what the Quran says, right? Yeah.
So I think I have two problems for you. One, in agreement with Bruce, Levinson is trying to do something here like, he's very clever. Okay, from what you're describing, it's very clever to say that everybody has to become a Jew to become that new universal kind of person. But he's responding, you help me here if I'm wrong, to an argument back to Isidore of Seville, who says there's something wrong about Judaism that makes it very limited. These people are corporeal, they're not as spiritual, and so on. What I'm saying is there's something dishonest about what Levinson is saying. It's very clever, but it can't be right that this is what Paul really wants us to do, is to become Jews so that we can become this new universal thing. So I'm suspicious of going too long with Levinson. The second issue, I'm liking the second question. I have, of course, a sense that Muslim philosophers consistently ignored Epicureanism and even Stoicism, because Stoicism looks materialistic too, like Epicureanism. Epicureanism looks ridiculous to any religious person because of this pleasure discussion, even though, of course, if you think about Lucretius, it's much more complicated than that. There are exceptions among Muslim philosophers who adopted aspects of Stoicism. Ibn Bajjah, in my mind, is one of them, and Ibn Rushd is one of them. And Ibn Rushd in particular was a problem for most Muslim philosophers because the guy just looked like a materialist at the end. I wouldn't say atheist, but somewhere between, not a pantheist either, because he believed, of course, there are two foundations for existence. One is that Hayal, the shapeless, formless matter, and the one who acts on it, that's God. But they're kind of in the same space. So I don't think natural religion is going to work. So the two problems, again, to be concise, I don't think we should go with Levinson as far as you're going. And natural religion is really a confusing term, and it doesn't give the sense that you want to say. Maybe I am a natural religionist, but to the extent that I am that, I am farther from being a Muslim. So it's very hard to really make the case that the standard Islam is the natural religion.
Well, I can't say anything more than I said about Levinson because my disclaimers, I'll just repeat my disclaimers, right? So, either they're accepted or not. But I will speak some more about the relationship between natural Islam and Islam, right? So I think what the Quran is affirming is that there is a kind of natural piety that is consistent with basic human common sense, right? That would not lead us to the kinds of practices that Lucretius is condemning, that those are blasphemous practices and known to be blasphemous by our common human reason, right? It requires something perverse to convince us that, to honor God, we slaughter things that He's created and not use them. It's much greater blasphemy to kill our own children, right? Thinking that that's going to please God, right? Now, we also have a natural disposition to feel a sense of awe when we talk about God, right? Sort of some of the verses. But we don't know, but our natural reason cannot tell us the precise way to honor God, right? So natural religion has a certain kind of, can only take us so far, but we need it, or else we couldn't recognize revelation to be true. We couldn't distinguish true revelation from popular religion, right? So there must be some content in natural religion. It can't simply be, it's got to be more than the deism of Thomas Jefferson, but it can't specify like how to worship God. Now it's interesting, Shatibi, when he analyzes Muslim prayer, lots of times you read usul al-fiqh books and they tell you, well, prayer is ta'abbudi, it's beyond the capacity of reason, it's just arbitrary, we just take it as we get it, right? Shatibi has an aesthetic interpretation of prayer. He says prayer has to appeal to us at an aesthetic level that's consistent with our status as sort of rational beings, right? That's why in prayer we stand and we say certain things that honor God, then we bow and we begin to ask God certain things. We say a few things from the Quran that represent these higher values. So we can't rationally determine it the way we can prove the Pythagorean theorem, but it's not arbitrary because it has to be aesthetically satisfactory, right?
Right, it didn't originate with Shatibi, but it is.
And so it's not, so there's got to be, natural religion has to be specified in some sort of way. It can't be rationally specified, right? It has to be sort of, that would be the role of prophecy. But, again, going back to my larger project of political theology, if you go back and look at the story of Abraham and his son, what happens when Abraham gets the dream? First of all, in Islam, God doesn't tell Abraham to do anything. Abraham sees himself, he has visions, maybe even nightmares. And then he asks his son, he tells him, I'm having these dreams in which I'm killing you. What do you think we should do? Right? So this is a different model of revelation in that there's a joint interpretive project here. Whereas, like Khan, when he explains it, right? It says there's an arbitrary command that comes from on high as a miracle that we can't explain at all from the perspective of reason. It's completely arbitrary. That's why, again, for Khan, the connection between sort of the sovereign and the subject is completely arbitrary, right? That's why the sovereign, through the exception, determines the political, and we sort of accept it. The same way Abraham accepted God's command to kill his son, right? Which I think is deeply problematic from a democratic perspective, right? That's why, again, I think the Quranic rendition is much more consistent with a theology of popular participation. Anyway.
Just one last comment. I mean, from the Christian tradition, if you want to think about natural religion and political philosophy, an instructive episode, of course, would be the earlier 20th century argument between Karl Barth and Emil Brunner on natural theology, how much of God can we tell from the world. And interestingly, Barth's interest in all of that later very soon developed into opposing what he sees as the Nazi theology of the National Church, the German National Church, which Barth sees as going all the way back to a natural religion, cutting loose from revealed religion from his point of view. Mm-hmm. And he sees a continuity there, which is why he opposed natural theology so much. So I think if the interest there is in natural religion and all the rest of it, that episode repays some historical study.
I don't know, I'm not sure how the idea of a national church can be reconciled with natural religion, the way I'm interpreting the Quran, because
try Nazi history, it can be done.
No, but the way that I'm interpreting what I'm calling the Quran's view of natural religion is that it is interior in every single person. Right? So there is no idea of a sovereign, right? I mean, if you go back in Western political theory, so Hobbes' solution to the religious wars is to make the king a prophet, right? How do we know religious truth? The king tells us what it is, because the king is a prophet. The king can adjudicate all religious claims, right? Now, I think that that's a completely different approach than in the Islamic approach, in which every person, like Abraham's child, is in a position to interpret and assist in interpreting revelation, right? And the ruler's only role is not to determine true religion, but to determine a common good, like sort of in this life, right? So, I mean, maybe they're using, I mean, I think Barthes is using natural religion in a way very different than my own. But when I'm saying natural religion, I mean it's something that is part of a universal human, for lack of a term, nature. Not a popular idea, right? But because of that, you don't need the sovereign exception that Nazism depended on. So
You might just want to be careful about your use of the word natural religion.
maybe, sure.
Anybody else wants to ask any religion? Kathy, I'm surprised. You're satisfied. Okay. Well, we can call it a day. Thank you, Muhammad.
You're very welcome. Thank you.